For 45 years, they said they would never give it up, not under sanctions, not under military strikes, not under the most suffocating diplomatic pressure any nation had endured in the modern era. The enriched uranium was not simply a weapons program to the Islamic Republic. It was the regime's reason for existing, its claim to regional supremacy, the card that made every enemy think twice, every negotiation tilted in Tehran's favor, every threat from Washington and Tel Aviv land with less weight than it otherwise would have. Iran has agreed not to possess nuclear weapons. Iran has agreed to hand over its stockpiles of enriched uranium. And they've agreed to it very powerfully. Read those words again. Not a ceasefire, not a pause, not a temporary suspension under inspection protocols that Iran could quietly walk back in 6 months. A surrender of the most strategically significant asset the Islamic Republic has ever possessed. The red line the IRGC said for decades it would die before crossing. Crossed. And the way it happened, without a single American soldier entering Iranian territory, without an airborne operation into underground fortresses, without the most complex military raids since Normandy, is the part of this story that even Washington did not fully anticipate. Stay with me, because what just happened in Iran is one of the most consequential events in the history of the Middle East, and the full weight of it has not yet landed. To understand why this moment is so historically shattering, you need to understand what that uranium actually was. Not technically, strategically. The 2015 nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, had constrained Iran's enrichment program to 67% purity, with a stockpile ceiling of 300 kilograms under continuous international inspection. It was a framework that kept Iran's nuclear capabilities at a distance from weapons-grade material that neither Israel, Saudi Arabia, nor the United States could accept being closed. Then Trump withdrew from the deal in his first term, and Tehran released the brakes, first to 20% enrichment, then 60%. By June 2025, the stockpile of uranium enriched to 60% had exceeded 440 kilograms. That is enough fissile material, properly processed, for more than 10 nuclear warheads. The time frame that experts call breakout time, the period between a political decision to build a weapon and the technical capacity to actually detonate one, had collapsed to something approaching zero. For Israel, this was not an abstract security concern. It was an existential nightmare with a running clock. For Saudi Arabia, which had been watching Iran's regional power accumulate for decades, a nuclear-capable Tehran represented the end of whatever strategic equilibrium the Gulf had maintained. For the United States, a nuclear-armed Iran in a region where Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey had each privately communicated that they would pursue their own programs in response, meant the beginning of the most dangerous proliferation cascade in the nuclear era. The uranium was distributed across 3 underground fortresses that had been built specifically to survive American and Israeli airstrikes. Natanz, buried in the heart of mountains, surrounded by concrete and lead shielding. Isfahan, holding roughly half the total stockpile in tunnels more than 90 meters deep. Fordow, Basilt, entirely inside a mountain, constructed to resist direct attack from the most powerful conventional munitions in existence. The June 2025 strikes had severely damaged these facilities. A significant portion of the stockpile had been buried under rubble. But here is what the strikes could not solve. Uranium enriched to 60% does not disappear through radioactive decay. It does not degrade. It does not become harmless. It can remain at weapons-relevant enrichment levels for hundreds of years. The bombs destroyed the infrastructure. They did not destroy the material. And material, given time and resources, can be reconstructed around. The program could be rebuilt. This is what drove the Pentagon to present Trump with a ground operation plan that defense officials described in unambiguous terms as a logistics nightmare more complex than Normandy. The 82nd Airborne Division would paradrop into hostile territory and construct a runway from scratch under fire. Delta Force and Navy SEAL teams would blast through 300 feet of rubble to reach tunnels 90 meters underground. Operators in hazmat suits would enter the underground facilities with radiation sensors, checking every cylinder for booby traps, advancing step by step through environments where a single mistake meant contamination. All of this stained under continuous Iranian missile and drone attacks for weeks on end. Only a few dozen soldiers in the entire United States military have received training in nuclear material recovery operations. The plan was possible on paper in the same way that almost anything is possible on paper. In practice, former defense officials called it something they could not recommend executing. Trump looked at that plan, and then he looked at a 21-mile-wide strait in the Persian Gulf, and he chose the strait. On April 13th, the U.S. Navy declared a full blockade of Iranian ports at the Strait of Hormuz. Shadow fleet vessels, ships that had successfully moved Iranian oil through back channels for years. All of them turned back. 97% of Iran's oil was going to China before the blockade. American destroyers redirected Chinese-linked tankers regardless. The tanker Rich Sterry appeared to pass through, was tracked, and was redirected back to the Persian Gulf. The surveillance architecture was total. The enforcement was complete. But the blockade did not just stop oil. The bulk of Iran's food imports came by sea. Wheat, rice, cooking oil, pharmaceutical materials, spare parts for industrial equipment. All of it moved through Hormuz. The blockade sealed both ends of Iran's economic circulatory system simultaneously. Nothing went out. Nothing came in. And in Tehran's highest decision-making rooms, the people who understood the numbers did the math that the blockade forced them to do. Within 10 days, oil wells would begin shutting down from storage overflow. Once shut, some would never fully recover. Within 10 days, food stock buffers in major cities would begin running visibly thin. Within 10 days, industrial facilities dependent on imported raw materials would start going dark. Within 10 days, the money flows sustaining every function of the Iranian state, from soldier salaries to proxy network financing, to the government subsidies that maintain the last threads of the social contract with the Iranian people, would be effectively zero. Uranium enriched to 60% is a bargaining chip, a powerful one. A decades-long investment in leverage and deterrence and the psychology of regional dominance. But what does a regime do with enriched uranium when its economy has collapsed? What does a government accomplish with a nuclear program when its people cannot find fuel? What does the IRGC protect with its sacred stockpile when the regime itself is 2 weeks from structural failure? The Hormuz blockade answered the question that no amount of sanctions pressure had ever forced Iran to confront at this speed and with this finality. Uranium is a bargaining chip. Hormuz is a matter of regime survival. And when those two things come into direct conflict, only one of them determines whether the regime exists next month. Iran came to the table, and it brought the uranium. But here's the layer of this story that the headline does not capture. The layer that is more dangerous than the agreement itself. The layer that will determine whether what Trump announced actually happens. Iran is not a homogeneous structure governed from a single center. It never has been. And right now it is more fractured than at any point in its post-revolutionary history. On one side stands President Masoud Pezeshkian, wanted a ceasefire before the war reached its current intensity. He has been publicly warning, in language that was extraordinary for a sitting Iranian president, that the economy will completely collapse within 3 weeks. He has been the face of the faction that understands, with clear eyes, that the regime cannot survive the economic trajectory the IRGC's war strategy has produced. Pezeshkian's position on the uranium is pragmatic in the coldest possible sense. Hand it over, lift the blockade, keep the regime standing. Institutional humiliation? Yes. Retreat from 45 years of declared principle? Yes. But a regime that is humiliated still exists. A regime that is economically annihilated in the next 14 days does not. On the other side stands IRGC Commander Ahmad Vahidi, and according to Iran international sources, what Vahidi has been doing while negotiations proceeded is not passive objection. It is active seizure of state functions. Vahidi has been blocking presidential appointments, filling intelligence ministry positions himself outside the constitutional process that requires presidential authority, pressuring the Supreme National Security Council Secretary to be replaced with someone aligned with the IRGC's interests, effectively seizing executive powers that constitutionally belong to the civilian government. Pezeshkian formally demanded that executive powers be returned to the civilian administration. Vahidi absolutely refused. This is not a policy disagreement between two branches of the same government. This is a constitutional coup being executed in slow motion inside a regime that is simultaneously trying to negotiate with Washington, manage a popular uprising across dozens of cities, maintain military operations with soldiers who are deserting in groups, and prevent the economic collapse that is now 2 weeks away. And above both of them, providing neither clarity nor resolution, floats the ghost of constitutional authority. Mojtaba Khamenei, declared supreme leader after his father's death, almost never seen in public, constitutionally the commander-in-chief of all Iranian armed forces. In practice, Vahidi is running the command. The legitimacy vacuum created by a supreme leader who cannot function is the single most important enabler of the IRGC's power seizure. Every decision requires authorization that cannot be obtained, which means the entity willing to act without authorization wins the institutional contest. The IRGC is willing to act without authorization? That is the entire point of what Vahidi has been doing. Now place the uranium handover decision into this picture and ask the question that every intelligence service watching Tehran is asking. Can the IRGC sabotage this? The answer, technically, is yes. Multiple methods exist. It could obstruct the physical handover process, block access to facilities where stockpiles are stored, delay inspections, create bureaucratic friction that extends the timeline indefinitely while the regime claims good faith compliance. It could move stockpiles to different locations, underground facilities Iran has never officially acknowledged. The IAEA has consistently documented that Iran's declared nuclear activities do not account for all of Iran's nuclear activities. Material moved beforehand over cannot be verified as missing until inspectors have unrestricted access to facilities the IRGC controls. It could underreport, declare a portion of the stockpile surrendered while retaining a concealed reserve that preserves the technical option it is publicly abandoning. The declared stockpile is the verified stockpile. The undeclared remainder is the insurance policy. These options exist on paper. Whether they can be executed in practice depends on the answer to a different question. Does the IRGC believe it can survive what happens if Trump concludes that Iran is not complying? That is a specific and dangerous thing to do to a specific and dangerous man with 3 carrier strike groups and a ground operation plan already drawn up and sitting on a shelf. The IRGC faces 3 options. None of them are good. Except the uranium handover, institutional suicide for the organization that built its entire identity around protecting that stockpile. The resistance narrative collapses. The legitimacy of the IRGC's existence is fundamentally questioned, but the regime survives. And a surviving regime is a platform from which the IRGC can eventually rebuild, sabotage the decision, and continue the war. This invites Trump to play every card on the table simultaneously. The blockade intensifies. The ceasefire ends. The ground operation plan that defense officials called a logistics nightmare stops being a plan on a shelf and starts being an order and execution. The 82nd Airborne, Delta Force, SEAL teams, the whole architecture of the most complex military operation since Normandy becomes the IRGC's direct consequence for choosing sabotage over surrender. Internal coup, topple Pezeshkian's government, declare military rule, end the diplomatic process. This option removes the last faction arguing for regime preservation through negotiation and hands the entire Iranian state to the organization whose strategy has produced the current catastrophe. It would be, as one analyst described it, hammering the last nail into an already collapsing regime. All three options mean loss for the IRGC. But the calculus of which loss is most survivable is the calculation that is being made in Tehran right now, in the space between Trump's announcement and Iran's official confirmation that has not yet come. The regional implications of this moment are already reverberating in ways that are reshaping the Middle East's strategic architecture before the ink on any agreement has dried. For Israel, the uranium handover removes the single threat that has dominated its national security planning for 2 decades. The nuclear dimension of the Iranian threat, the scenario that drove successive Israeli governments to maintain strike capability against underground facilities on the other side of a hostile region, the possibility that kept Israeli intelligence services in a state of perpetual vigilance for 30 years, has been formally placed on the table for surrender. Within hours of Trump's announcement, Netanyahu signaled readiness to engage in Lebanon's ceasefire talks. The timing was not coincidental. With the nuclear shadow removed, the calculus of every other regional negotiation changes. Hezbollah without Iranian nuclear backing is a different organization than Hezbollah with it. The psychological architecture of Iran's proxy network was always built partly around the implied protection of the nuclear deterrent behind it. Remove the deterrent, and every proxy recalculates its risk exposure without that protection. For Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, the relief is existential, but also complicated by what comes next. The nightmare scenario, a nuclear-armed Iran in a region where Saudi Arabia had privately communicated it would respond in kind, has been avoided. The proliferation cascade that American analysts described as inevitable if Iran crossed the nuclear threshold does not happen. At least not now, and not from this cause. But the Gulf states are not simply breathing a sigh of relief and returning to previous positions. They are moving, actively, immediately, because the lesson of the past months is not just that Iran's nuclear program is gone. The lesson is that Iran's entire strategic architecture, the Hormuz control doctrine, the proxy network, the resistance economy, the deterrence through nuclear ambiguity, all of it has been exposed as more fragile than anyone believed. And fragility, once revealed, invites permanent response. The most consequential long-term development emerging from this crisis is not the uranium handover itself. It is what the Gulf states are doing about Hormuz. Because the Islamic Republic has used its capacity to close that strait as its ultimate diplomatic weapon for 4 decades, the threat, explicit in crisis moments and implicit in every other negotiation, that Iran could choke 20% of the world's oil supply by closing a 21-mile waterway, was the structural foundation of Tehran's leverage in every room it entered. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have concluded that this leverage must be permanently eliminated, not managed, not deterred, eliminated, architecturally, by removing the geographic dependency that made the leverage possible. Massive bypass pipelines and canal projects are now underway across the Arabian Peninsula. Roads designed to carry Gulf oil and gas to global markets without transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Some existing pipeline infrastructure is being dramatically expanded. New corridors are being planned and financed. The engineering ambition involves numbers measured in hundreds of billions of dollars and timelines measured in years. But the strategic logic driving that investment is not primarily economic. It is geopolitical. When Gulf oil can reach global markets without touching Hormuz, the Islamic Republic's ultimate card is canceled. Permanently. Without a military strike. Without a negotiation. Without any Iranian agreement or cooperation. The geography itself is being re-engineered to make the threat impossible to execute, rather than simply deterred against. This represents a category of strategic thinking that is historically unusual. Not fighting over terrain, eliminating the terrain's strategic value by building around it. Iran's weapons card will be canceled, not by American warships maintaining a blockade indefinitely, by Saudi and Emirati construction equipment moving through desert terrain, while the world pays attention to the diplomacy. The geopolitical revolution being engineered in the Gulf is quieter than everything else happening in this crisis. It is also more permanent. But between Trump's announcement and that permanent future lies the most dangerous period of this entire crisis. The hours and days immediately following a forced public capitulation by an organization like the IRGC are not hours of stability. They are hours when the internal calculation being made by men like Vahidi reaches its most acute and most unpredictable point. Because the IRGC's entire institutional narrative, the story it tells itself and the Iranian people and its proxy partners about why it exists, why it controls the economy, why it demands the budgets and the privileges and the authority that it does, rests on the claim of unbreakable resistance. That claim just broke, publicly, announced by the American president, attributed to Iranian acceptance, broadcast to every government and every population and every proxy organization that is being told for 45 years that the uranium was the red line that would never be crossed. Hezbollah is running the math. The Houthis are running the math. Iraqi militias are running the math. If Iran surrendered its nuclear card under economic pressure, what does that tell us about the value of the protection we were promised? If the IRGC's most sacred commitment could be reversed in 2 weeks of blockade, what is the IRGC's commitment to our security actually worth? Those questions, once asked, cannot be unasked. The proxy network was sustained for decades by the perception of Iranian power and reliability. Perception, once shattered, does not reassemble around a press release. It requires years of demonstrated capacity to rebuild. Iran does not have years. It barely has weeks before the economic consequences of the current situation become structurally irreversible. And the Iranian people, who the regime's state television assured had 87% war support, and a poll from a source that was never named, are standing in fuel lines in an oil-producing country and watching the regime that told them their sacrifices were necessary for regional dominance. Surrender the centerpiece of that dominance to the country it has called the Great Satan since 1979. The 2009 Green Movement erupted from a stolen election. The 2019 uprising erupted from a gasoline price increase. The 2022 wave erupted from a young woman dying in police custody. Each was triggered by a single visible injustice that crystallized accumulated grievance into organized protest. The current conditions are heavier than all three of those moments combined. Economic collapse, military defeat, and diplomatic surrender are happening simultaneously. The trigger that ignites the next wave does not need to be dramatic. The kindling is already everywhere. Here is the picture as it stands. Trump announced that Iran has agreed to surrender its nuclear stockpile. Iran has not officially confirmed this. Between the announcement and the confirmation lies a gap in which the IRGC's decision about whether to accept institutional humiliation or escalate toward regime destruction is still being made. Vahidi is seizing state functions. Pezeshkian is demanding them back. The supreme leader is in a coma. The ceasefire deadline has passed. The blockade holds. The storage tanks are filling. The oil wells are approaching the point of shutdown from which some will not recover. The soldiers are deserting. The proxy networks are asking whether dying for Tehran still makes strategic sense. The Gulf states are building pipelines that will make Hormuz irrelevant before the decade ends. And somewhere in the underground facilities that American strikes buried under rubble, the uranium that the IRGC called its national pride and its resistance shield and its reason for existence is sitting in conditions that no one in Washington can fully verify, and no inspector has yet accessed. The United States did something that its own defense officials called nearly impossible. It convinced Iran to surrender its most strategic asset without executing the most complex military operation since Normandy. It did not send the 82nd Airborne. It did not deploy Delta Force into 90-meter tunnels and hazmat suits. It closed a straight turn time against a regime that was already cracking from within, and waited at a table until the mathematics of survival overrode 45 years of ideological commitment. It worked, at least on paper, at least according to one announcement, at least for now. But the IRGC's silence in the hours since that announcement is not necessarily acceptance. It might be the calm before the most dangerous decision the organization has ever made. Because surrendering the uranium surrenders the narrative. And the narrative is all the IRGC has left. Something unthinkable just happened in Iran. And the most unthinkable part is not the surrender itself. It is what happens next inside the regime that was forced to make it. That answer is still being decided. In Tehran, in tunnels, in rooms where men who have been fighting each other since 1988 are choosing between survival and the story they have told themselves their entire lives. The world is watching, and the clock has never been closer to midnight.